Now, let's say our code is finished and we're happy with the code. Now it's time to finalize our metadata, so to say. Let's start with Android. There in the app folder, in the source folder, you have your Android manifest. In there, you set the Android label, for example, and that's the name of the app which users see on their home screen or in the app drawer. So for example, I will name this Great Places, and you can pick any name you want here. This is what your users see, so pick a nice name here. This Android name here is nothing you should change, that's an internal identifier. Now another thing you want to make sure in the Android manifest is that you're setting the right permissions. I showed this throughout this course. Certain packages need certain permissions. For example, when we're working with the user location, we need to get the permission to get the user location. Now there's one tricky permission actually in Flutter apps. You might notice that in your app source folder, in the Android folder, you also have a debug folder with another Android manifest file. Now this is a very short file which has only one permission, the internet permission. In the end, this file is merged with your main Android manifest file automatically by Flutter whilst you are working on your app in development mode. The internet permission is required by Flutter to talk to your development server which is running on your machine. And that's in the end the setup that enables this hot reloading, hot refresh stuff. That's all managed through behind the scenes internet connection between your app and your machine, so to say. That's why every Flutter app needs the internet permission during development, but not necessarily in production. If your app does need internet access in production, and for example, this app does need it because we have the location helper where we're sending a HTTP request, if your app needs that, you need to copy that permission line from the Android manifest in the debug folder into your main Android manifest. So here, right next to the location permission. Otherwise, your app will work during development, but not after you published it or once you build it for production. So really make sure you're setting this up correctly. You can also change your package identifier here. The idea behind this identifier is that it's unique across the entire App Store. That's why you typically use your own domain, if you own one of your own website, in a reverse way. So for example, for me, since I own Academind.com, I could use com.academind great_places. Now, if you have no domain, you can come up with one. This doesn't have to exist, but you should of course take one that probably really doesn't exist and isn't owned by anyone, so that you ensure that you really have a unique identifier for your app when you then publish it to the app stores. Because that's in the end the idea. Have a unique identifier here. Now, if you're changing your ID here, you should change it in all the places where it's referenced. For example, also here in the debug Android manifest, and also in your main activity.java file, where we're also importing from it, because this will be used everywhere to tie your app together thereafter. Another place where it's getting used is the build.gradle file in your app folder in the Android folder. There, we're also referring to that application ID, and here you should adjust it as well. Now, whilst we are in that file, let's also see what else we can set there. For example, you can set your min SDK version or your target SDK version for this project. Now, these are some Android specifics. The min SDK version defines the minimum Android version expressed as a number which your app supports, and on older versions it won't be installable. And this target SDK version simply normally targets the latest stable Android version. You can read more about the configuration here, also in an attached link to this lecture. The default settings here normally should be all right. So really just make sure you adjusted this application ID. Let's now do the same for iOS. So let's go to the iOS folder. And there it's the runner folder in which we work. There in the info plist file, you should check that all your permissions are set up correctly, but unlike as we did it for Android, here you don't need to set a specific internet permission, so nothing to do regarding that. And the identifier is also not set directly here, but we will set it somewhere else instead. The somewhere else is Xcode. So let's fire up Xcode now. And there simply open your iOS folder in your project folder, and then the runner XC workspace file. So not the Xcode project file, but the XC workspace file. Open that, and then here make sure you got your project selected here in this project folder view. And then under targets, Here you can set the display name, like Great Places, which is shown on your screen. And then here you can also set up your own unique identifier, which doesn't have to be the same one as for Android, but the idea is the same. It's unique across the entire App Store, and therefore you want to use a reverse domain. If you own one, use that. Otherwise, come up with one which probably isn't owned by someone else. And then here, simply create such an identifier. One tiny difference compared to Android is that instead of having great underscore places, for iOS you typically use the camel case notation here, which means you start with a lowercase character, but then the next word inside of the word starts with a capital character. So Great Places with a capital P. With that, we have a unique bundle identifier here, we have a display name, and that's it for now. Now let's move on to the next step.